to talk about today, specifically about the Canadian real estate market and how some banks are doing a kind of funny trick and it's manipulating the housing market here in Canada. We've got a lot of weird numbers that sort of aren't making sense, and we're going to put them together and make some sense of them today. We saw real estate prices in Canada, specifically in Toronto as well, tick up over the last month, while the overall year-over-year trend is definitely down. And there is a reason that we're starting to see this tick up, and it has to do with the Bank of Canada and what these big banks are doing. We're going to go over all of that today in the live stream. If you're just tuning in, let me know that you're here in the chat, and let's dive into this stuff. So specifically, I want to talk about CIBC and something that they are doing that is rather different and rather shocking. I'm going to walk you through exactly what should be happening and what's actually happening, right? Of course, we all know back in April of 2022, the Bank of Canada started raising interest rates, and they raised them really freaking quickly, up 4.25% over just about 6 to 8 months there. We saw that major increase. Now, in a situation like that, you would largely expect real estate prices to come dropping down or drop down significantly as a result of the higher interest rates. Typically, when people say this, there's a rule of thumb that every percent up that you go, I believe the rule of thumb is that prices tend to go down about 10%, right, with every full point increase. But we're not seeing that rule of thumb actually play out here, which is a little bit confusing, right? We're not seeing a high volume of sellers hitting the market. We're not seeing these people panic and sell. So what's happening? Typically, if interest rates are going up this much, people aren't able to make the payments and they start to panic and they sell their houses, but that's not happening. The big question here is why? Well, I'm going to show you here. Yeah, just seeing because some people hop in chat. If you're not already chatting in here, drop your chat. Okay, oh, there we go. We're in. Let me know that you're here. Let's get into this. I want to show you something from CIBC, and this is actually really quite shocking, and I didn't realize this until I read this article. Take a look at this. Yeah, so I've seen a lot of people hopping in here while you're up. Sally, ML Savage, Robert, Pebbles, James. Hey, great to see you here on the live stream. This is what I think is so shocking. I'm going to go over this chart and then I'm going to explain what it really means and why I think it has such a large impact here. So this is showing. Let me get my Epic pen up here so I can annotate this. All right. So this is the remaining amortizations for CIBC residential mortgages. A quick refresher for folks who aren't familiar, amortizations are essentially how long your loan is stretched over, right? The shorter the amortization, the higher the monthly payment. The longer the amortization, the lower the monthly payment. Like if you have a $500,000 mortgage and it's had all of that's to be paid over 10 years, well, that's a short amortization and the payments are going to be higher to pay off that $500,000 than if it's a $500,000 mortgage on a 25-year amortization. Obviously, with 25 years, your monthly payments can be a lot lower because that's the amount of time you have to pay down the loan. That's what the amortization means. Now, here is what is so shocking. Take a look at quarter one specifically. Take a look at quarter one. Oh, that's not a great view, is it? At quarter one, 2022. I'm going to slide this over so you can see it a little bit more clearly. Take a look at quarter one, 2022. This is where I found it rather shocking, okay? We've got quarter one, 2022, and the typical mortgage in Canada over the past number of years has been around 20 to 25 years, right? And we saw 45% of mortgages in Q1 2022 being 20 to 25 years, with 27% of mortgages being the kind of weird one between 25 and 30 years, right? Obviously, extending out the mortgage amortization brings down those monthly payments rather significantly. Hey, I'm seeing more people here in the chat. We've got Effie and Clayton. Effie, thanks so much for being a supporter of the channel by being a channel member. Click that join button to do so. Great to see you. Robert and Susan, it's great to see you tuning in here to the live stream. So we're talking about, actually, let me pull this back over and actually get it, even if it's not the best zoom for you, you can actually see it all. We've got 45% in 20 to 25 years, typical, and 27% in 25 to 30 years back in 2022. This is just like a year and a bit ago. That was like the weird one, right? To have an amortization of over 25 years, that's just not super typical here in Canada. But people will extend that amortization out to lower the monthly payments. So maybe some people were saying, hey, well, we can pay this off over 30 years, and as a result, we can afford we can afford the monthly payment now that it's lower. Now, when we talk about 30 and to 35 years amortization and 35 years or more, well, that's simply unheard of. Look at this. Simply unheard of in Q1 2022. CIBC didn't have any of these types of mortgages on their books. It was all inside, or the vast majority of it was inside the 20 to 30 year range. Now flip over to a dramatically different story that we're seeing now in Q1 2023. Just 1 year between 2022 and 2023, and the entire mortgage landscape for CIBC's residential mortgage book has changed. Right? This is CIBC specifically, Rob. I see Rob Ackerley in there saying, is this coming from B lenders? This is from CIBC's residential mortgage book. So an A lender here, right? We call the big banks in Canada A lenders. B lenders are, you can sort of start to say credit unions and other sort of options. C lenders, you get into private lenders and sort of higher interest rate, higher fee loans. A lender, this is CIBC. So this is what's so shocking to me, is that Q1 of 2023, this is the most recent data from CIBC. Well, all of a sudden, the things that weren't even heard of before, extending your mortgage out to 35 years plus, well, now that's becoming a lot more normal. We're going to talk about why this is happening and what it's doing to the real estate market in today's live stream. So, okay, we see a little bit of a reduction between 2023 and 2022 in terms of 20 to 25 year mortgages, down to 31% in Q1 2023, down from 45% the year prior, 17% in 20 to 30 years, what was previously a little bit weird. We see that coming down a little bit from the 27% in Q1. That's because now there's a weirder mortgage on the scene, right? It's not just 25 to 30 years that people are able to extend out into. Now we're seeing 30 to 35 years at 3%, and then a whopping increase at 35 years and more. So that could be a 35 or 40 more likely, or where the most of those mortgages are. So why would a big bank change their entire mortgage book? Well, I believe that it's out of a fear that people will not be able to pay their mortgages if they have a standard amortization. With higher interest rates, certainly for variable rate mortgages, but also non-variable rate mortgages for people who are having to renew, with interest rates where they are compared to where they were when they purchased their house, people just aren't able to make these payments anymore. So CIBC is left with a problem, right? They're saying, okay, people can't make their mortgage payments anymore because of the higher interest rates. Well, we could go under power of sale and sort of foreclose on them, to use some sort of not exactly accurate terminology, but you get the idea. We'd go repossess the house and then sell it. But right now, the bank of these banks, CIBC, they're underwater on the mortgages too. If they repossess this house, well, they likely aren't making all of their money back selling into this market that is sort of dampened by these higher interest rates. So that's not a great idea. It costs a lot. It's a lot of work. You got to put someone on the file to actually go prepare this house and sell it under power of sale. But that story changes when we look at option number 2. They say, okay, what can we do to make it so that this person can continue to make their monthly mortgage payments? Well, we don't want to foreclose on them, so we want them to keep on making these payments. So let's do something called an amortization extension. And that's what I believe is happening here, right? We have people not able to make their payments on around 20 to 25 years and 25 to 30 year amortizations. But if we can spread this out and allow people to pay off the value of their mortgage over a longer period of time, which is exactly what extending an amortization is, and they do that here to 30 to 35 years and 35 years and more, well, then all of a sudden people can make the payments again. Even if they're just barely paying the interest on their property, barely paying down any equity or building up any equity by paying down the loan, even if that's the case, this is still favorable for the big banks, right? Because they don't have to put someone on the file and get them and foreclose on the property and then sell it under power of sale. Instead, they can just say, hey, you just keep paying us. You're paying mostly interest anyways, so we'll just let you extend your amortization. I think that this is wild, right? It's kind of kicking the can down the road, and that's why that is in the thumbnail for this video, is kicking the can. We kicked the can because that's what the CIBC did here. They said we could be in a mortgage crisis here where people can't actually qualify for mortgages at these current interest rates, but they can qualify for it if we extend these amortizations out infinitely, not necessarily infinitely here, but 35 years and more, being up at 27%, that is a big deal. Yeah, so how are they able to do this? This is the question, right? It was my understanding that via regulations, you could only, for most residential mortgages, go up to 30 to 35 years tops, like 30 would be the end of it. But now it seems that like 27% of their book is all of a sudden 35 years and more. And I thought that wasn't something that was regulatorily possible, but perhaps there's been a change here from OSFI or some of the other big bank regulators. I need to look into that a little bit more to find out exactly what changed here to allow them to go from 35 years, or from the 25 to 30 years being the weird one, to 35 years plus being the weird one now, with 27% of their mortgage book in this area. Yeah, so this is wild, and I think that this is why we're not seeing the turnover in housing that we would typically see in a situation where interest rates are going up dramatically, right? This is kind of giving a safety net under the housing market because people can still afford to make their payments on their home, because even if interest rates are higher, you slam out that amortization 5-10 years, and all of a sudden, hey, I'm paying actually less than I even was at my lower interest rate because I have a crazy long amortization. It's pretty wild. And we're going to check out some videos here and talk about, because obviously this is going to impact the Canadian housing market if more banks start to do this and expanding the amount of their mortgage book that has a long amortization. But we also have to look at what this means for the Bank of Canada amidst new information that we've got just over the past week about Canada's GDP, Canada's inflation, and what the Bank of Canada is going to do likely because of this new information we just got. Because we all know that one of the biggest levers on the Canadian real estate market is macroeconomics, right? What central banks do and what they do to their interest rate, their key policy rate, their overnight rate, how they change those things dramatically impacts the Canadian real estate market, because real estate is an extremely interest rate sensitive industry, right? So it's pretty wild. I'm seeing some people in here in chat. If you're watching and you're not already in chat, make sure you hop in there and join in on the discussion here. We've got Clayton and said KMS and Basematic. Yeah, why not 50-year mortgages? Everything is fine. Yeah, let's kick the can. We talked about this with the Canadian government, talking about issuing 50-year bonds, right? Extending their debt when rates were low last year. Probably not looking at doing that now with rates higher. What's the maximum amount that one can typically pay off of the principal each year? 20% more? I think it's different depending on the lender, right? Some mortgages will have prepayment penalties, so you won't be able to pay off more than the amount that you're supposed to in that year, but it's different from lender to lender. Cal says homes will be condos, no homes on a lot anymore. Yeah, people are leaning towards density to solve some of these issues. And reading a couple more comments here. Yeah, what's going on with subprime auto loans right now? That's another thing that I need to dive into and inform myself a little bit more before we cover it here on the channel, but super interesting. Yeah, Smurf RBC extended my mortgage to 80 years. 95% of my payment is now interest. Hey, it doesn't matter if 95% of your payment is interest, because you're going to be dead before your house gets paid off. So, and you've lived there all this time with a low payment. So I guess that's best of both worlds, even though if you're not benefiting from the equity. So that's probably what some people are thinking, is like, hey, this is our only option. We got to do it. We've got to do it. All right, so let's get into some of these videos that I wanted to show you, because it seems that people are starting to, and this sort of backs up what I've been saying here around why CIBC might be doing this. Specifically, this is a new survey from Nanos on Canada's housing problems, saying it's a ticking time bomb is what the way they describe it here in this video. But it's specifically about how many Canadians are worried about making their mortgage payments and compared to previous years. I'm gonna throw my buckets on here. And I wanted to show you this, and let me know what you think of it. Let's hop into YouTube theater mode, and you can see chat. We're in. Take a look at this.
Welcome to CTV News Trendline with Michael Stittle.
That's my. If you're on the last live stream, you know I like to watch this stuff at like 3x speed. We're gonna go back down to the normal speed for this one.
Nick Nanos.
We recently did a survey for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and we've been tracking how worried or not worried people are about paying for the rent or paying for the mortgage in the next 30 days. And what's interesting is the trend. So back in 2020, we had a benchmark We asked people how they felt about paying the rent or the mortgage in the next 30 days. About 16% were worried or somewhat worried. About 82 or 8 out of every 10 were somewhat not worried or not worried at all. But check out the number now. So in the most recent survey that we just completed and released for 2023, that 16% of people that were worried or somewhat worried is now 24%. So it's up a full 8 percentage points over the last couple of years, and about 3 out of every 4 are not worried. But the interesting dynamic here, Michael, is that back in 2020, the folks that were most likely to be worried about paying the rent were young people, people that are under 35 years of age. So not a big surprise, right? But now when we fast forward, there's an increasing number of middle-aged Canadians who are worried about paying the rent. And that's a big change. So the other thing is, I guess if you're over 55, you're not worried about paying the rent or the mortgage, because probably you have a small mortgage or no mortgage at all. And you're on some kind of stable income. So a lot of anxiety out there, and worry about just paying the rent or paying the mortgage is on the upswing.
Just to bring this back to the federal Liberals, if it's an older age group that's now worried about housing costs, to me that suggests that really goes into the base support group of the Liberals and could spell trouble.
Oh yeah, like it's one thing, people always say, a lot of young folks don't vote. So, but if middle-aged people start worrying about paying the rent, how's this? I think housing is going to be the sleeper issue. Because, the one thing that we haven't talked about, it's actually quite important, is that the Liberals have also announced that they're going to bring in 500,000 new Canadians. And you know what? Whenever we do polling, people are not against immigration. They just want it to be orderly. But where are they going to live? Like if there's pressure on the housing market today, what is bringing in another 500,000 people, and where are they going to live, and what impact will that have on the housing market? I think this is a ticking time bomb, housing. And worry about our housing policy, and worrying about paying the rent. And I think the Liberals are going to have to try to diffuse this before it blows up, because it could be very ugly. Because they're bringing more Canadians in, and Canadians are okay with bringing in more people, but where are they going to live? And
this is the wild thing, right? This is like, they're saying how many more people are, like almost 1 in 4 people are worried about paying their mortgages and rent. But at least on the mortgage side, with what we now know about CIBC and the way that they're extending their mortgages for people, likely for people that are in distress, for people that aren't able to renew, then maybe people don't need to be worried about paying their mortgage, because you can simply get a mortgage extension, extend your amortization out and reduce your payments. Even if you're not paying down your house as quickly, it at least solves the short-term problem, right? If someone's hemorrhaging money to an expensive variable rate mortgage at a 25-year amortization, then they're going to say, I don't care if I'm losing equity. I don't care if I'm not building up equity in my property as quickly. They're going to say, yeah, I'm going to take the mortgage, the amortization extension, because that can solve my cash flow problems. Cash flow problems are for today. Equity problems are for tomorrow. Even if I'm not gaining as much from the increase of value in my home over time, or that's what people thought over the past 20 years, is that it's only going to increase. Well, they might be entering a changing era of that right now. But they're saying, I don't care if I don't get the benefit of the appreciation of my property as greatly because I don't have as much equity in the property. Don't care, as long as my cash flow problems, my problems of today, as long as I can reduce my mortgage and pay for my food, then that's going to be okay. And you can see why people would start to agree to this sort of thing. And Nick Nanos here from Nanos, which is a study that we're going to look at in just a moment, the very one they're talking about in this video, his point is that, okay, well, now we've got people who are in this prime voting age, the people who are more engaged politically, and now we have the Liberal government who could be caught in an interference scandal here, especially if the NDP push hard on getting an inquiry. Watch the most recent 2 videos on the channel if you want to learn the whole lowdown on that. But we could be entering a period where there could be an election imminent here if the NDP really push on this issue, which means it's extra important that the Liberals have the support of this sort of middle-age group of people. People that Nick Nanos here is saying, well, they're not going to be too supportive of you if they're worried about paying for their mortgage and they're actually not able to pay it. And on the housing file for the current government, I think that it hasn't been extremely successful. We've seen tons of money poured into the National Housing Strategy, Ahmed Hassan being the MP that is managing that right now, but we don't have the results from that National Housing Strategy. We aren't seeing an increased rate of home ownership, even with the first time home buyers savings account. That's not the exact name. First home savings account, kind of like a TFSA and an RSP mashed together to help you save up for your first home. We don't have any data on whether or not a program like that has just started will even work, along with like the funding that's going into the National Housing Strategy. Nothing to show for it really, and even the money that's going into the National Housing Strategy to decrease homelessness, CMHC, the beneficiary of that money, is saying, well, we don't actually have any data on whether or not we're actually reducing homelessness with these billions of dollars that are being spent. So the frustration in the housing area for all, I think, would be an apt assessment of it. Let me show you what the study that we were just talking about with this video. Flip this up. Oh, not full screen. We don't want that. We want that. This is the slide that they were looking at. Let me go back to browser and I can slide this over so you can see it more clearly. And we can actually see specifically the increase here over time of the amount of people that are worried about paying for their mortgages over time. Not a large amount here, just 16% of folks in 2020, ballooning all the way up to what is that? That's 24%, and that's how they get nearly 1 in 4 that they're saying over here. So a pretty dramatic increase from 16% to 24% of people that are worried. The big driver of this, of course, being the Bank of Canada needing to raise interest rates to tame inflation, right? Interest rates from the Bank of Canada are one of the largest impacts on the Canadian real estate market, if not the primary impact, right? Because not only do interest rates impact the mortgage, like the rate that you can get on your mortgage, but they also impact the broader economy and how wealthy you feel, right? By increasing interest rates, things start to get more expensive. Businesses hire less. We tend to see unemployment going up. We tend to see GDP slow down and stall. We're going to get into that in a moment because we are seeing data about that right now. All of that combined makes it even less likely that folks are going to feel like it's the proper climate to purchase a home. But we still haven't seen this onslaught of sellers because of the CIBC amortization extension that we're seeing here. Yeah, so it's pretty wild. Let's flip over to talking about the Bank of Canada and inflation after a quick sort of check-in here on chat. Nice beta bot with the emojis. Okay. Government's not interested in reducing hopelessness. Do not get sucked into the politicians' BS. Yeah, it can be BS quite a lot of the time. The system is just ever changing. At the end of the game, what do you have? An old body, a house we are old to live in, and then death. Thank God there. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry that you're feeling that way. I mean, so I think a lot of people are struggling with the direction things feel like they're going right now. Yeah, and Matthew, we're going to talk about that as well. Canada pausing and USA not pausing causes a conflict too, specifically with the impact on the Canadian dollar, right? If we have, we'll get into this in a second, but generally, if the US dollar is getting stronger because they have a more aggressive central bank, the Federal Reserve, right? They're sort of establishing more of their credibility and the value of the US dollar with these high interest rates and the continuation in the increases of interest rates, while the Bank of Canada is looking like they're going to be paused now. Well, maybe that means that the US dollar gains more credibility than the Canadian dollar, and credibility directly translates to value, right? So a weakening Canadian dollar could be one of the results of the Bank of Canada's upcoming pause, which it does look like is going to happen. Yeah, pretty wild. Let's get into this. This is where we were before, and this is where we are now. My favorite, most not dry page in the world, absolutely, it's incredibly dry, is Stats Canada. Take a look at this. Actually, I'm going to zoom out here and then slide this over so you can see it a little bit better. I don't want it to be too small so you can actually see what I'm talking about here on the same screen. But the point I'm trying to make is that take a look at this number right here. Can we pause that? Pause. Okay, cool. Look at this. This is the first time we've seen this in a long time in Canada is zero quarterly GDP growth. That's 0%, right? Now, when you see gross domestic product, which also can be an indicator of quality of life in a country, and stall like this, typically you're thinking that's pretty bad, right? We want the economy to grow because the economy sort of thrives on this sort of Ponzi scheme of constantly needing growth, constant growth to increase the quality of life for Canadians and to increase the amount of money that individual Canadians make. 0% growth is a bad thing in that context, in that framing. Now, let's shift our framing from being just average Canadians and shift it to, if you're the Bank of Canada, what are you trying to see? What do you want to see if you're the Bank of Canada when it comes to GDP? Right now, they're trying to bring down demand for goods. They're trying to decrease business growth. They're trying to do all of these things to reduce inflation specifically, right? To reduce inflation specifically. The Bank of Canada is more worried about inflation becoming entrenched and lasting for the long term than they are worried about GDP stalling, business growth stalling, unemployment going up. These are all sort of side effects of raising interest rates. To the Bank of Canada, this is 0%. Let me zoom it in there for you. That 0% is something that they're incredibly happy about, right? Because it validates their recent indication that they're planning on pausing interest rates. It says the economy is slowing. What we're doing, raising interest rates, is having an impact. We can see it in the GDP numbers. We can see that we've only had 0% growth in the fourth quarter, probably the quarter where our interest rates in the second quarter are actually starting to show up in the data. They can say, we're making the right decision here because we can pause. We can continue to pause and potentially, now they'll never say this, potentially pivot and lower interest rates in the future. But for now, they're going to wait and see and make sure that that inflation comes down, right? That's the end goal, keeping inflation extremely low. Or getting it to decrease back to their acceptable band between 1% and 3%. So they're seeing this GDP number and they're saying, hell yeah, we're doing our jobs, right? We're doing the right thing. This is what we wanted to have happen. This is exactly what they want to see, even if it's not what individual Canadians want to see, right? We talk a lot on the channel about GDP GDP per capita and how that can be an indicator of a quality of life, like how much money is made per person in Canada. Roughly the definition, obviously leaving a little bit of gray area in there, a little bit not going into extreme detail on exactly how that works, but GDP per capita is roughly a measure of quality of life in a country, right? Better healthcare, better education, better jobs, more money made per person. So interesting to see the GDP stalling. We can also talk about it in the context of the government's upcoming budget, where they use debt to GDP as their main fiscal anchor, but I think that that's a story for another day. So we've looked at gross domestic product and the growth of it, 0% in quarter four. The other major thing that the Bank of Canada is looking at is, of course, inflation, and what they're seeing in terms of the direction of inflation is going. And that is shown here in this graph, right? They want to see inflation go down. GDP stalling is a good sign that in the future, inflation is going to go down, right? Or that's the trend that it's going in, because if we have less growth, less demand for goods and services, of course, supply and demand, less demand, same supply, means prices go down, in theory, right? And that's what we're starting to see here. The total CPI ticking down to 5.9. That's the data for January 2023. Remember, there's a little lag, right? We don't get the February's data until mid-March. We don't get January's data until mid-February. That's why we have January's data. 5.9%. What that means is that the Bank of Canada is liking what they're seeing, right? Inflation's starting to come down. Our GDP is sort of stalled here. The Canadian economy is stalled. You'll see these news articles saying, "Oh no, the Canadian economy, we're not growing anymore." But this is the best case scenario for the body that is trying to make Canada's economy more stable by hitting that inflation point. Of course, all of this caused largely the inflation problem caused by quantitative easing and the decisions of the Bank of Canada at the beginning of the pandemic. But you'd get me ranting on that if I went into too much depth on it. So they're liking what they're seeing. They're seeing inflation is coming down. And even though we see these sort of headlines saying Canada's economy surprises with Q4 flatline. The key takeaway is that it backs up the rate pause. It says to the Bank of Canada, keep doing what you're doing because you might have already done enough. Some people are afraid that the Bank of Canada is going too far, right? Or already has gone too far with its interest rate hikes, because we generally don't feel the full impact of an interest rate increase until about 8, 12, 14, 16 months after the interest rates go up. So a lot of people were glad that the Bank of Canada said we need to pause right now, and we're going to pause, conditionally pause is the language they use, to make sure that they don't go too far. Perhaps the Federal Reserve in the States, in continuing their increases, is going too far and could result in a prolonged recession, a prolonged protraction of the economy. The Bank of Canada says, hey, maybe we've timed it, maybe we threaded the needle right here, such that we raised rates enough that we're not going to see an incredible wave of unemployment and deep recession, but we can also get out of this inflation situation. Their biggest fear, of course, being that they didn't go too far and we get double dip in inflation, a double dip recession, right? Where we start to pause on the interest rate hikes, maybe even lower interest rates a little bit, but then inflation comes back and bites again. That's what the Bank of Canada doesn't want to happen, because it would dramatically impact their credibility. They say we're going to get inflation under control, and what we as Canadians believe from the Bank of Canada is very important to them. Our opinion of their ability to do their job is very important to them because of inflation expectations and how that impacts what inflation actually does, right? If we think inflation is going to be here for the long term, we buy today because tomorrow is going to be more expensive, right? If we don't trust them to get inflation down, it makes inflation worse. So this is why forward guidance in the language the Bank of Canada uses is so important, as is their credibility. And so we've seen a lot of commentary here on this GDP stall, and I want to show you some clips on that and sort of discuss it in the context of this video. Take a look at this.
At the Conference Board of Canada. Pedro, what's your...
That's how you know that I've started on a video, albeit like watching it at chipmunk speed, because I can't stand how slow people talk sometimes. It's mostly when I'm watching committee meetings in the House of Commons. I'll watch it at 3x speed, but...
Now to Pedro Antunes. He's chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Pedro, what's your take?
Well, I guess it's a little bit strange to be saying, well, it's good news to see no growth or slightly below the growth below what was expected, because in essence, that's telling us is that hopefully monetary policy will continue to have success in taming down the economic activity so that we can get the inflation numbers down. So I suspect markets will view this favorably, especially as we've seen really strong employment growth over the last couple of months, including data that we have on employment to January, which was phenomenally strong. So the fact that total economic activity is still flattish despite that strength in employment, I think will be, a successful monetary policy news story for markets.
Yeah, so that's what we've seen, right? That the element we didn't touch on, which is employment numbers, right? The Bank of Canada has also sort of seen that the employment numbers haven't ticked down, unemployment hasn't ticked up, and wage growth hasn't ticked down either, sitting around between 4 and 5% right now on an annual basis in terms of wage growth. These are other elements that go into the Bank of Canada's decision making about what they do with interest rates. If we saw a dramatic decrease in employment, right? Something you'd expect when you see interest rates going up, the Bank of Canada might be even more happy about pausing, right? Right now, we haven't seen that dramatic uptick in unemployment. So the Bank of Canada is kind of worried, saying, okay, if people still aren't unemployed, that means businesses aren't firing, businesses aren't contracting, maybe we're going to see more inflation down the road, but the GDP will be a weight off their back that we've sort of seen stall growth there. Some evidence towards saying they've done the right thing in pausing.
And here's a number we have not told viewers yet. The StatsCan provides a so-called flash estimate of January gross domestic product growth, and what we're hearing from StatsCan is that according to that preliminary estimate, and it is subject to revision, GDP expanded by 0.3% in January, led higher by oil and gas extraction and wholesale trade. That followed an unexpected 0.1% contraction election in December that we've already told viewers about. So what does that do to the narrative, Pedro, where the preliminary data suggests a reasonably healthy advance in GDP in the month of January?
Well, I mean, I guess the fact that it's in the resource sector, at least, well, we'd have to look at all the details, but I think that is good news. Where monetary policy has been having success is in, well, we know it really well. We know that in real estate markets, we've seen a very significant cooling, and you'd expect to see that. And we continue to see, at least up until November, the activity on retail sales quite flat. The volume of retail sales is
He talks about a cool down in real estate. And admittedly, we have seen a cool down in real estate sales volume, right? We haven't seen the cool down in terms of pricing to the extent that we would expect given the amount of interest rate increases or the severity of the interest rate increase that we've seen, right? Typically, you'd expect prices to come down more than they have. But we haven't seen any volume. We haven't seen as many sales, as many transactions happening. Now that has a couple of different impacts. The first one being, if you don't sell properties as much, you don't have as accurate comparables to price the next property at, and people who are purchasing houses also don't have as accurate comps because there's not as much volume in the market. Your neighbor down the street didn't sell recently because volumes are down, so you don't really know what your home is worth, and people who are trying to purchase in a neighborhood don't really have an accurate sense of that home's value because there's no value or there's no volume to create the amount of comps that you're wanting to see. So we've seen a cool down in terms of volume, but not necessarily price. Because we're not seeing people panic sell. Maybe this is connected to what we talked about at the very beginning of the stream with CIBC and potentially other banks extending the amortizations on mortgages that are on their books. We saw the data, if you weren't here at the beginning of the video, was that 27% of CIBC's residential mortgages are at an amortization of 35 years or longer, when 25 years was the standard for years and years and years in Canada. 35-year amortization, meaning they're shrinking their payments, but paying less, paying down the loan less, right, on a monthly basis. Interesting stuff.
Been really quite stable and even declining. So that's where the Bank of Canada can have an impact. It's in those areas of consumer spending, and that's where it wants to have an impact. So the fact that we're seeing a continued rebound on the resource side, on the energy side, I think that just reflects essentially a sector that is still recovering and that is benefiting from very high oil prices. So I don't think that's necessarily bad news for the month of for the flash estimate for January.
We are almost at the point where we are lapping the first interest rate increase from the Bank of Canada in this rate hiking cycle. And as we always say, economists tell us that it can take, depending on what part of the Canadian economy you're talking about, it can take a full year before an interest rate hike or a series.
I want to talk on that just for a moment. Yeah, like this is where it's going to be incredibly important to be watching the Canadian economy over the next couple of months. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep talking about it. Hit the notification bell so you can be here live with me when we do these live streams, and like the video if you haven't already done so. That's why it's going to be so important to keep your eyes on this over the next couple of months, over the next 2, 3, 4 months, largely because we're now hitting that period where even aspects of the economy that are less sensitive to interest rates, well, we should expect to see the interest rate hikes sort of flow through to them. We see real estate impacted extremely quickly because interest rates directly correlate to what people can pay for houses because of the increase or decrease in mortgage costs. Incredibly interest rate sensitive, but there are other other industries that are not as sensitive to interest rates. And now, after a year, we're going to start to see all of the impacts of that. So that covers most of the stuff that I wanted to talk about with you today. I think I'm going to try to keep this live stream brief so that folks who are scrolling through the channel after the fact aren't like, hey, I'm not going to watch a 2-hour video. Maybe people will be more into a 40-minute one. Any last minute questions before we wrap this up? Again, I'm hoping to make these streams a little shorter, but a little bit more frequent, so we can sort of really get into the data here. I see Joe Mo saying they tried foreclosing mortgages in the U.S. mortgage system in 2005 to 2010. Neighborhoods bulldozed over. Wonder how a recession would impact this country. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, technically, all we need is is it 2 or 3 quarters of zero growth to say we're in a recession? So I'd say perhaps we are already in a recession. Like that's the data from January or December that we saw with 0% GDP growth, right? And all you need is 2 or 3 quarters of zero GDP growth, which we could be in already right now. All signs are pointing to that we would be in 0% territory or even negative territory, negative growth. So we could be already in a recession right now. That's kind of my thought, is that if we've seen the start of the recession potentially of Q4 2022, that maybe we are in the midst of a recession. Recessions typically aren't declared until after the fact, right? Important to remember. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, Susan. Thank you. Have a great night to you as well, Susan. Yeah, it's interesting. We're going to be watching all of this stuff, but thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I hope you enjoyed these live streams. Thanks for liking the video and sharing this channel with your friends. It helps me out dramatically when you do so, and it makes it so that I can bring you more of this content after I'm done working throughout the day, hopping on here and trying to make videos to make sense of all of this for you as much as I can. But yeah, again, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. I'll see you next time. Have a good one. Peace.